Hey everyone, ready to dive deep into Redux? Whether you're brand new to it or looking to level up your state management game, this one's for you. We've got mountains of documentation, code examples, all that good stuff. We're ready to untangle Redux.
One of the things that I think makes Redux so powerful is that it solves this real pain point in React, which is this thing called prop drilling. And as your app grows, passing data down through a bunch of components can get really messy really fast. And Redux, along with React's context API, offers some elegant solutions to that.
Yeah, so let's unpack this prop drilling problem a little bit more.
Mm.
Imagine you've got this deeply nested component tree in your React application, and you've got a component way down there, but it needs data from way up at the top of the tree. Without Redux or context, you'd have to pass that data as props through every single component in between, and that's where things get really messy.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
it's like playing a game of telephone where the message gets distorted along the way. And Redux kind of comes in as this reliable messenger. It provides a central hub where you can store and manage your application's state and make it accessible to any component that needs it.
So it's like a town crier, making sure everyone gets the message loud and clear. And then, here's where things get really interesting. Redux Toolkit. It's like the Swiss Army knife of Redux development.
Yeah. Redux Toolkit, or RTK, has become the industry standard for modern Redux. It simplifies a lot of the setup and the boilerplate, and it includes some really nice utilities.
So if Redux is the town crier, RTK is like the megaphone, amplifying its power. And then let's talk about Immer. This one kind of blew my mind. Normally you can't just change the state directly in Redux. It breaks immutability, which is, really important. But Immer lets you write code that looks like you're directly changing the state, but it safely keeps that immutability behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's really interesting how it kind of lets us, write more readable and intuitive code without sacrificing those core principles of Redux. We can have our cake and eat it too, right?
It's like RTK. You've got a personal assistant cleaning up your messy desk while you're working. And then RTK also introduces this concept of slices. And so instead of having separate files for actions and reducers, the slice pattern groups this related logic together into a single file.
Yeah, it makes your code base so much more understandable and maintainable. Like imagine you're working on a feature that deals with user authentication. So all that logic, like the actions, reducers, and even asynchronous logic can all live together in that slice file.
Yeah, it's like having this dedicated toolbox for each feature of your application. Now, you can't talk about Redux without mentioning the Redux DevTools extension. It's like X-ray vision into your application state.
Oh, absolutely. They're indispensable for debugging. You can
Yeah.
literally see every single action that's dispatched, how the state changes in response. You can even step back and forth through the application's history. It's like a time machine for your code.
I love that analogy, like rewinding a movie. Okay, so selectors. These are kind of like specialized lenses. They help you efficiently pull out the exact data that you need from the Redux store.
Yeah, they're essential for keeping components lean and performant. So instead of having your components reach directly into the store and grab whatever they need, selectors kind of act as these intermediaries, and they fetch only the specific data that's needed.
It's like a feeder, having a personal shopper in a department store that grabs exactly what you need. And then you can also memoize selectors using libraries like reselect, and this can significantly boost the performance.
Yeah, memoization is like having a really, really good memory. So if a selector's already fetched some piece of data based on specific input, it's just going to remember that result and
Yeah.
return it instantly next time instead of recalculating it.
So we've got our central store, our actions, reducers, selectors. Are there any common misconceptions about Redux?
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest ones is that everything needs to go in the Redux store.
Yeah.
Like while Redux is fantastic for managing global application state, not every single piece of data belongs there.
So it's not like a black hole sucking everything in.
Exactly. Like local component-specific data, like the value of an input field in a form, that's best managed within the component itself.
Yeah, it's all about finding the right balance, Redux is great when you need that predictable, centralized way to manage state that's shared across a bunch of components, but
Mhm.
like form inputs, which are often really transient, really local to a component, keeping them in component state just makes a lot more sense.
So it's like
Yeah,
having different storage solutions for different things. Like you wouldn't keep your everyday clothes in a bank vault, would you?
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of the right tool for the job,
Hmm.
we talked about React's context API a little earlier. How does that compare to Redux? And like, when would you choose one over the other? So context is kind of like Redux Lite. It gives you a way to share data across components without that prop drilling, but maybe without all of the features of Redux.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Context is really good for simple global state
Mhm.
like themes or user authentication status or preferred language settings. Think of it as a way to teleport data down the component tree without having to pass it through every single level as props.
So if Redux is the town crier with a megaphone, then context is like a direct message,
Exactly.
getting the information where it needs to go without telling the whole town.
Yeah, and that's really the key to choosing between context and Redux. Context is great at sharing simple state across many components, but Redux is like the powerhouse. When you're dealing with complex state with lots of updates and you need features like time travel debugging, which context doesn't give you.
Okay, so let's
Yeah.
circle back to Redux for a second. You mentioned thinking of reducers as state machines earlier. Can you expand on what you mean by that, and why is that an important way to think about them?
Yeah, so when you think of reducers as state machines, you're basically defining this set of rules for how your state can transition from one state to another, and each action represents a possible trigger that can cause the state machine to move to a new state.
So instead of just blindly updating state based on an action, it's adding this layer of logic that says, hey, does this action even make sense given the current state of our application?
Exactly. It's about making sure that those state transitions are valid and they're predictable. Think about like a traffic light. It can transition from green to yellow to red, right? But it can't go straight from green to red.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Sure. Okay, so normalizing state in Redux, what does that mean?
So normalizing data in Redux is all about structuring your state in a way that makes it super efficient to retrieve and update data. Imagine you have like a blog with posts and comments. So instead of nesting the comments within each post object, you would store those posts and comments separately, each with its own unique ID.
So it's like separate tables in a database.
Yeah, exactly. And this normalized structure makes it much easier to update specific items because you only need to modify that one piece of state instead of traversing and updating multiple nested objects. And there's a fantastic library called Normalizer, which can help automate that whole process for you.
That sounds super useful,
Yeah.
especially as working with larger, more complex data sets.
Yeah, it's like having this well-organized filing system where you can quickly find and update specific documents.
Okay, one last thing. Redux and forms. There's this idea that Redux is overkill for forms.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
What's the truth to that?
Well, it is true that storing every keystroke and change in a form directly in Redux can be kind of inefficient. Remember, Redux is really designed for managing that global application state, and the transient data within a form doesn't always fit that description.
So avoid Redux with forms completely.
Not necessarily. It's all about finding the right balance again. So the best approach is to keep that form state local to the component and let React handle those frequent updates efficiently. And then, once the user actually submits the form, then you can dispatch an action to update the Redux store with that final form data.
So you're keeping your Redux store lean and focused on the data that really matters, like having a rough draft that you work on locally, and then you submit the final polished version. Okay, we've covered so much here. Redux Toolkit, Immer, slices, selectors, DevTools, even context API. What are your thoughts? Any questions bubbling up?
It sounds like you've really been absorbing all this Redux knowledge. Those are great questions. It sounds like you're really starting to think critically about how Redux fits into the bigger picture. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Redux Style Guide. It's basically a collection of best practices and recommendations from experienced Redux developers.
It's like a treasure map to clean, consistent, maintainable Redux code. And one thing that really stood out to me in the style guide was this idea of treating actions as events rather than setters. Can you break that down?
Sure. So instead of having an action that directly sets a value, like type,
Yeah.
C2 surname, payload, Alice, you had have something like type user log button, payload.name Alice.
Ah,
Okay. So it's about describing what happened in the application, not just dictating how the state should change. It's like saying, set the thermostat to 72 degrees versus the user adjusted the thermostat to 72 degrees.
exactly. That second one gives you so much more context, right?
Yeah.
And there are a few benefits to this approach, like it leads to more meaningful action names, which makes your code easier to understand, and it encourages you to think about these state transitions in a more event-driven way.
Yeah, and I can also see it making debugging easier, too. When you look at the action log, you're not just seeing set this, set that. You're seeing a narrative of what happened. Exactly. Now, another guideline from the style guide is the recommendation to avoid putting non-serializable values in your state or actions. So things like functions or promises. Why do you think that's important?
Well, from a debugging perspective, if you try to inspect a state object that has a function nested in it, it's not going to be pretty. And
Yeah.
like Redux dev tools,
Yeah.
they rely on being able to serialize and deserialize your state. And those non-serializable values can really mess things up.
Absolutely. So keeping your state and actions serializable ensures those tools like the dev tools work smoothly. It makes it easier to reason about the data flow in your application.
Okay, so the style guide also mentions allowing multiple reducers to respond to the same action. At first glance, that seemed a little counterintuitive. Wouldn't that lead to, like, unpredictable behavior?
It's a valid concern, but it can actually be a really powerful pattern when you use it thoughtfully. Think of it as like broadcasting an event across your application. And different parts of your state can choose to react or ignore that event based on their own specific logic.
Okay, so, like, going back to our music player example, the song selected action. That could trigger the now playing reducer to update the current song, and then the playlist reducer could add it to the recently played list.
Exactly. It allows for a more decoupled architecture where different parts of your state can kind of evolve independently while still reacting to those shared events.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, asynchronous logic, crucial part of web applications. We talked about thunks and listeners earlier. Can you remind us how those work and how they're different?
Sure. So thunks are basically these special functions that have superpowers. They can dispatch actions, they can access the current state, and they can even perform side effects like making API calls. So if you need to like fetch data from an API and then update your Redux store based on that response, a thunk is the way to go. Listeners, on the other hand, they're more like event handlers that live within your Redux store. They let you react to specific actions or state changes and trigger additional logic.
So if I wanted to, like, to display a notification every time a user adds something to their shopping cart, I could use a listener to watch for the item add action.
Exactly.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored Redux, best practices, debugging tools, asynchronous logic. We've even debunked some common myths. Any final thoughts for our listeners who are ready to start using Redux in their projects?
Yeah, Redux is really powerful, but it's not a magic bullet. So don't feel like you have to put everything in the Redux store. Just start small, focus on the state that truly benefits from this centralized approach. Embrace those principles of immutability, predictability, and testability. And most importantly, have fun with it. Redux can be so rewarding once you get the hang of it.
That's great advice. And remember, the world of web development is constantly evolving. Redux is a crucial part of building those robust, scalable applications. And hopefully this deep dive has given you the tools and confidence to tackle those state management challenges in your own projects.
And remember, the learning never stops. The Redux Style Guide and the Redux Toolkit documentation are fantastic resources. Keep experimenting, keep building, and keep sharing your knowledge.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, happy coding.